My name is Thomas Avery. I'm 103 years old. I was 18 when I first put on a uniform during World War II. Most of the men I fought beside never made it to 25. I made it to 103, and I've spent the last 80 years asking myself one question: why me? When you live this long, people expect you to have grand answers. They expect wisdom to just fall out of your mouth like poetry. But the truth is simpler than that. I was just a farm boy from Ohio. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew your father, your dog, and your mistakes. We didn't have much. My mother used to patch my shirts so many times, the patches had patches. My father believed in three things: hard work, silence, and keeping your word. Back then, the world felt small, safe in a way. My biggest worry was whether the harvest would be good or if I'd embarrass myself talking to a girl at church. We listened to the radio every evening. That wooden radio sat in the living room like it was a family member. It told us about storms, about baseball games, about presidents. And then one evening, it told us about war. I didn't understand politics. I didn't know what Europe really looked like, but I could hear the tension in the announcer's voice. Even before America officially entered, you could feel it coming, like thunder rolling closer. When attack on Pearl Harbor happened, I remember my mother dropping a plate in the kitchen. It shattered on the floor. That's how I remember that day, the sound of breaking porcelain. My father didn't say much. He just stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the radio like it had personally betrayed him. Within days, the town changed. Young men started standing straighter. Older men started looking worried. There was a shift in the air, like childhood had officially ended. I was 18, strong, restless, proud, and I thought I understood what courage was. I didn't. I enlisted before my draft letter even arrived. Not because I was brave, but because I didn't want to look afraid. That's something I've learned about young men over the years. We confuse fear of embarrassment with courage. We think stepping forward means we're fearless, but I was terrified. The day I left home, my mother hugged me tighter than she ever had. She didn't cry in front of me. She waited until I stepped onto the train. I saw her through the window, her shoulders shaking. That image stayed with me longer than any battlefield. Basic training was loud, chaotic, cold, sergeants yelling, boots slamming dirt, rifles cracking against the air. They shaved our heads, issued us uniforms, stripped away who we were, and replaced it with something else. At night, lying in those bunks, you could hear it, the silence between breaths. Dozens of boys pretending to be men. No one admitted they were scared. But you could feel it. It lived in the way we stared at the ceiling a little too long. In the way letters from home were read over and over until the paper softened. We trained for months, learned to shoot, learned to march, learned to obey without hesitation. They taught us how to kill. They didn't teach us how to carry it afterward. When we shipped out across the Atlantic, the ocean felt endless. The water stretched so far it looked like the edge of the world. I stood on deck one night, wind cutting into my face, and I remember thinking, there's no going back now. I didn't know where exactly I'd land. I just knew it would be somewhere in Europe, somewhere men were already dying. The closer we got, the quieter everyone became. You start thinking about strange things before war. I remember wondering who would feed our dog back home. I wondered if my little sister would remember my face if I didn't return for years. Fear makes your mind wander in peculiar directions. When we finally set foot in Europe, the smell hit first. Smoke, damp earth, something metallic in the air I couldn't quite name back then. The sky looked gray all the time, even when it wasn't. We moved through villages where windows were shattered and doors hung crooked. Civilians watched us with tired eyes, not hopeful, just tired. War doesn't look heroic up close. It looks broken. My first real moment of understanding came before my first shot. We were positioned near a tree line. Early morning. The fog clung low to the ground. My hands were sweating so much I could barely hold my rifle steady. Next to me was a kid named Walter. He was 19, talked constantly back in training. That morning, he wasn't joking. He whispered, "Tom, do you think it'll hurt?" I didn't know what to say, so I lied. I said, "No." That's when I realized something. Leadership isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about absorbing someone else's fear when you're just as afraid. The first gunfire cracked through the trees like lightning. Loud, sudden, violent. My body reacted before my mind did. I hit the ground, crawled, shot in the direction I was trained to shoot. Time does something strange in moments like that. It stretches and compresses all at once. Seconds feel like hours. I remember the dirt spraying up near my face. I remember the ringing in my ears. What I don't remember is feeling brave. I remember feeling small. War shrinks you. You realize you're not the hero of some grand story. You're just a human being trying to survive the next minute. That first engagement didn't last long, maybe 20 minutes. When it ended, I looked around and everything seemed too quiet. Walter wasn't next to me anymore. He was 10 feet behind, lying still. There was no dramatic music, no slow motion, just silence. I stared at him for a long time, waiting for movement. There wasn't any. That was the moment my youth ended. Not because I saw death, but because I understood how random it was. Walter was faster than me, smarter than me, kinder than me, and he was gone. I wasn't. There was no reason. That realization stays with you for 80 years. People think war changes you instantly. It doesn't. It chips away at you slowly. After that first loss, something inside me hardened, not in a heroic way, in a protective way. You start building walls inside your mind. You tell yourself not to get too close to anyone, because getting close means losing more. There was a man named Joseph in my unit. Older, maybe 28, married, had a daughter he'd never met. She was born after he shipped out. Every night, he showed me her picture. Same picture, same smile. He'd say, "I just want to make it home long enough so she knows my face." War reduces your dreams to simple things. Not wealth, not fame. Just one more morning, just one more letter from home, just one more chance. I won't go into the gore. There's no value in describing blood to people who've never smelled it. What I will tell you is this. The scariest part wasn't the gunfire. It was the waiting. Waiting before an advance. Waiting for orders. Waiting for the next explosion. Waiting gives your imagination too much power. You think about your mother, your childhood bedroom, the sound of rain on your roof back home. You think about whether you'll ever hear those sounds again. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, you realize something that no one told you before you enlisted. You don't actually want glory. You want peace. One evening, months into deployment, we were resting near a ruined farmhouse. The sky had turned orange with sunset, almost beautiful in a cruel way. Joseph sat beside me. He said, "Tom, if we make it out of this, don't waste your life chasing things that don't matter." I laughed at him back then. I was 19. I thought life was endless. He wasn't laughing. He said, "Promise me." I nodded. A week later, Joseph didn't come back from patrol. I kept that promise. It just took me decades to understand it. By the time the war finally ended in 1945, I felt older than my father. I was 22. But inside, I felt ancient. When news spread that the fighting was over, men cheered. Some cried. Some just sat quietly, staring into nothing. I didn't feel triumph. I felt exhaustion. And a strange guilt, because I was alive. When I stepped back onto American soil, bands were playing, flags were waving, strangers were shaking our hands. They called us heroes, but I didn't feel like one. I felt like a man who had seen too much, too soon. My mother hugged me the same way she did when I left, but this time she cried openly. My father shook my hand. He held it a little longer than usual, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears in his eyes. People think surviving war is the hardest part. It isn't. The hardest part is learning how to live again afterward. That's where my real lessons began. But that's a story for the next part. Right now, at 103 years old, when I look back at that 18-year-old boy who thought courage meant not being afraid, I wish I could tell him this. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward while carrying it. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is come home and choose to live gently after seeing the worst of humanity. When I stepped off that ship in 1945, the world looked the same. The sky was blue, the docks were busy, people were laughing, vendors were shouting. Life had continued while we were frozen in time, somewhere across the ocean. I remember thinking, how can everything look so normal? Bands played patriotic songs, women waved handkerchiefs, children ran between legs, not fully understanding what had just ended. They saw uniforms. They didn't see what was inside them. My mother held my face in both her hands when I got home. She kept saying, "You're thinner," over and over. She made my favorite dinner that night: pot roast, fresh bread, apple pie. I chewed slowly, not because I didn't like it, because I wasn't used to eating without listening for gunfire. That first night back in my childhood bedroom, I didn't sleep. The silence was too loud. No distant artillery, no boots shifting on dirt, no nervous breathing from the bunk beside me, just crickets outside the window and my own thoughts. That's when the war really started for me. Nobody prepared us for the quiet. During the war, your mind is focused on survival. One step, one breath, one command at a time. Back home, there were no commands, no structure, just memory. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced I heard shouting in a language I couldn't even understand. My mother would rush into the room thinking I was sick. I'd tell her it was nothing. Men of my generation didn't talk about fear. We buried it. And when you bury something alive, it doesn't die. It waits. I tried to return to normal life. I got a job at a hardware store downtown, stocking shelves, carrying lumber. Simple work. People would come in and thank me for my service. Some would ask questions. Did you see combat? Did you ever shoot anyone? Were you scared? They asked like they were curious about a movie. I'd smile politely and say, it was a long time ago. It was every night. Joseph's daughter would have been 3 by then. Sometimes I'd think about her, about whether she'd know what her father gave up. And then I'd feel that familiar weight in my chest. Survivor's guilt is a quiet companion. It doesn't shout, it whispers. Why you? Why not him? Why did you get to come home and sit at this dinner table when he didn't? There's no answer to that question. You just learn to live beside it. A year after I came home, I met a woman named Eleanor. She had soft brown hair and a way of listening that made you feel like you mattered. She asked me once, early on, what was it like over there? I paused. I could have told her about mud, about hunger, about fear. Instead, I said, it was cold. She didn't press me. That's when I knew she was someone special. Some people try to pull your scars open. Others just sit beside you while they heal. We married in 1948. I was 25 years old, young enough to start over, old enough to feel like I'd already lived 2 lifetimes. Marriage saved me in ways I didn't understand back then. Eleanor would wake up when I had nightmares. She never complained. She just put her hand on my back until my breathing slowed. She once told me, "You don't have to fight anymore." But that's the thing about war. It trains your body to stay ready. Even in a peaceful kitchen with sunlight coming through the window, part of you stays on guard. I'd sit with my back against the wall in restaurants. I'd scan exits in crowded rooms. Loud noises made my hands shake. Back then, there was no word like PTSD, no counseling, no support groups. You were just expected to be grateful you survived. So I was, outwardly. Inside, I was still learning how to be human again. Years passed. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl, holding my son for the first time. That was the first time since the war that I cried without shame, because suddenly everything made sense. All the fear, all the loss. It wasn't about nations or flags. It was about protecting the future. When I looked at him, I understood why men fight. Not for glory, for the hope that their children won't have to. But here's something nobody tells you. Coming home doesn't erase what you saw. There were moments when I'd lose my temper over small things. A broken tool, a spilled drink. And afterward, I'd sit alone and feel ashamed. Because deep down, I knew my anger wasn't about the present. It was about ghosts. It took me years to understand that trauma doesn't disappear just because the war ends. You have to face it. And facing it is harder than facing gunfire. One night, about 10 years after the war ended, I had a dream so vivid I could smell the smoke again. I woke up shaking. Eleanor sat up beside me and said, "Tom, you can talk to me." And for the first time, I did. I told her about Walter, about Joseph, about the first time I realized I might die at 19. I expected her to look at me differently. She didn't. She just held my hand, and in that moment, I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Silence protects you in battle, but it isolates you in peace. That realization changed everything. As the years rolled on, the country changed. The world changed. New wars came. New generations went off to fight. Sometimes young men would ask me for advice before they shipped out. They expected stories of heroism. Instead, I told them this: protect your humanity more than your pride. War can strip you of many things. Don't let it strip you of your compassion. By the time I reached 60, most of the men I fought beside were gone. Reunions grew smaller every year. We'd sit in folding chairs, gray-haired and slower, and we wouldn't talk much about combat. We talked about grandchildren, gardens, fishing. Because when you get older, you realize life isn't measured in battles won. It's measured in quiet mornings survived. At 75, I stood in front of a classroom of high school students. They asked me what the war taught me. I looked at those young faces, confident, full of plans, and I realized something. War didn't teach me how to be strong. It taught me how fragile everything is. Friendships, youth, time. You think you have decades ahead of you, then one moment changes it all. That understanding followed me into old age. Now, at 103, I sit in this chair and look at photographs. Eleanor passed 5 years ago. I still talk to her sometimes when the house gets too quiet. My children are grandparents themselves now. Life moves forward whether you're ready or not. When people ask me what it feels like to live this long after surviving war, I tell them the truth. It feels like carrying a library inside your chest. Shelves of memory. Some beautiful, some heavy, some painful, but all of them part of you. If I could go back to that 18-year-old boy on the train platform, I wouldn't tell him not to go. History demanded it. But I would tell him this: you will lose friends. You will carry guilt. You will wake up in the night for years. But you will also love deeply. You will hold your children. You will sit beside your wife on quiet evenings. And you will learn that survival isn't the greatest victory. Healing is. War ends in a single day. Healing takes a lifetime. And at 103 years old, I can finally say this. The bravest thing I ever did wasn't stepping onto a battlefield. It was allowing myself to feel again after it. You would think that after surviving World War II, nothing in ordinary life would scare you. That's not true. Growing old is its own kind of battlefield. And unlike war, there's no clear enemy. When I turned 80, something shifted. Up until then, I still felt like I had time to fix mistakes, time to travel more, time to say things I hadn't said. But 80 has a way of tapping you on the shoulder. It says, you are closer to the end than the beginning. That realization is quiet, but it's powerful. Eleanor and I used to sit on our porch in the evenings. We didn't talk much about the war anymore. By then, the memories had softened around the edges. Instead, we talked about regrets. Not dramatic ones, small ones. I wish we had taken that trip to Montana. I wish I hadn't worked so many Saturdays. I wish I had apologized to my brothers sooner. That's something no one tells young people. Your biggest regrets won't be the risks you took. They'll be the moments you postponed. When Eleanor got sick, it happened slowly at first. Just fatigue, then hospital visits, then long stretches of silence in sterile rooms that smelled like antiseptic. I had faced artillery fire without shaking, but watching her weaken, that terrified me. War prepares you for sudden loss. It doesn't prepare you for watching someone fade. The night before she passed, she squeezed my hand and said, "You came back from war. You'll survive this too." I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow. After she was gone, the house felt larger, louder in its emptiness. Grief is not explosive like war. It's slow. It seeps into your mornings. It sits at the breakfast table with you. You learn to live beside it. By 90, I had outlived most of my friends. Funerals became more common than birthdays. Every time I stood beside another grave, I thought about Walter, about Joseph, about all the young men who never got the chance to grow old and complain about their knees. That's when the guilt returned in a new form. Not why did I survive, but what have I done with the survival I was given? That question changed me more than anything else. When you're young, you chase achievement, promotion, recognition, status. When you're old, none of that matters. Did you love well? Did you forgive quickly? Did you waste time holding grudges? I wasted time, more than I'd like to admit. There were years when I was too proud to apologize first. Years when I thought being right was more important than being kind. Let me tell you something at 103 years old. Being right is overrated. Peace is priceless. One afternoon when I was 94, my grandson asked me, "Great-grandpa, are you afraid of dying?" Children ask the questions adults avoid. I thought about it carefully. After living through war, after burying friends, after holding my wife's hand as she left this world, was I afraid? I told him the truth. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not appreciating the time I had. That's the real fear when you grow old. Not death, regret. People assume that living to 103 must feel like an accomplishment. It doesn't feel like a trophy. It feels like responsibility. And stories are fragile. If you don't tell them, they disappear. That's why I'm speaking now. Not for sympathy, not for praise, but because I've seen what happens when people wait too long to say what matters. There's something else I learned long after the war ended. Strength isn't loud. In battle, strength looks like charging forward. In life, strength looks like patience. It looks like staying gentle in a world that keeps testing you. I used to think toughness meant never showing emotion. Now I know that was fear in disguise. Real strength is allowing yourself to cry when your wife dies. Real strength is telling your children you love them before they leave the room. Real strength is admitting you were wrong. As the years stretched into triple digits, my body slowed, my hearing faded, my steps shortened. but my memory sharpened. That's another thing about aging. You forget where you put your glasses, but you remember the face of the first friend you lost in combat. You remember your mother's hands. You remember the smell of the ocean the day you left for Europe. Time compresses your life into moments, and those moments become everything. I visit the local memorial every year. The names carved into that stone haven't aged. They're still 18, 19, 20. I run my fingers over them and think about how different their lives might have been. Would Walter have become a teacher? Would Joseph have walked his daughter down the aisle? I'll never know. But I do know this: the years I was given are not just mine. They belong partly to the ones who didn't get them. That understanding changes how you live. It makes you less selfish. It makes you slower to anger. It makes you more grateful for ordinary mornings. If you're young and listening to me right now, you probably feel invincible. I did too. I thought 80 was ancient. I thought 100 was impossible. Now I am 103. And I can tell you something honestly. Life moves faster than you think. One moment, you're boarding a train to war. The next, you're sitting in a quiet room filled with photographs. The decades in between feel like a single breath. There were mistakes along the way. Times I worked too much. Times I was emotionally distant because I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen. If I could relive anything, it wouldn't be the battles. It would be the quiet dinners I rushed through, the evenings I chose television over conversation, the apologies I delayed out of pride. War taught me how quickly life can end. Old age taught me how easily life can be wasted. Those are two different lessons, both important. At 100 years old, a reporter once asked me what the secret to long life was. I told him there isn't one, but if I had to name something, it would be this: stay curious, stay connected. Isolation kills the spirit long before the body fails. After the war, I almost isolated myself permanently. Eleanor saved me from that. Love saved me from that. Community saved me from that. As I sit here now, at 103, I don't think about medals. I don't think about battles. I think about hands I've held. I think about laughter at the dinner table. I think about the sound of my wife humming in the kitchen. Those are the real victories. There's one final realization that came to me in my 90s. It's simple. You cannot control how long you live, but you can control how gently you live. War showed me humanity at its worst. Life afterward showed me humanity at its best. And if I had to choose what defines my 103 years, it wouldn't be the war. It would be the love that followed. I am 103 years old. I have lived through World War II. I have buried friends. I have buried my wife. I have watched the world change more times than I can count. And if this is the last time I get to sit in front of a camera and speak plainly, then I want to say something that took me a century to understand. When I was 18, I believed life was about proving myself, proving I wasn't afraid, proving I was strong, proving I could endure. War reinforced that idea. It rewards toughness. It punishes hesitation. But here's the truth no one told us. Life is not about proving. It's about preserving. Preserving your humanity. Preserving your relationships. Preserving your time. Because those are the only things that truly matter when everything else falls away. At 103, I wake up slowly. My hands shake when I pour coffee. My knees protest when I stand. I move carefully now, and when you move slowly, you notice things. You notice the light coming through the window. You notice the silence in the house. You notice the ticking of the clock. When you're young, silence feels empty. When you're old, silence feels sacred. I've had a long time to think about Walter, about Joseph, about Eleanor, about the choices I made and the ones I avoided. And here's what I know. The moments that defined my life were never the loud ones. Not the gunfire, not the celebrations, not the medals. It was the quiet decisions. Choosing to forgive when I could have held a grudge. Choosing to come home and build instead of staying hardened. Choosing to tell my children I love them, even when it felt awkward. Those are the moments that built a life. People often ask me what war taught me. War taught me how fragile life is. Old age taught me how precious it is. There's a difference. When you almost lose something, you panic. When you realize how valuable it is, you protect it. If I could sit across from my 18-year-old self, that boy boarding a train with a stiff jaw and nervous pride, I wouldn't tell him to be braver. I'd tell him this: don't waste energy trying to look strong. Spend it learning how to be kind. Kindness will outlive your strength. I have seen men who were physically powerful crumble under guilt. I have seen quiet, gentle men carry unimaginable burdens with grace. Strength fades, muscles weaken, pride dissolves, but character, that stays. And character is built in the smallest choices. When Eleanor passed, I sat alone in our living room one evening. The house was too quiet. I looked at the walls covered in photographs, weddings, birthdays, grandchildren, and I realized something that hit me harder than any battlefield ever had. None of those moments would have existed if I had chosen bitterness after the war, if I had let trauma define me, if I had closed myself off. I survived war, but love is what gave that survival meaning. Without love, survival is just endurance, and endurance alone is not a life. If you are young and listening to me, let me tell you something clearly. You do not need a war to teach you what matters. You do not need tragedy to wake you up. Do not wait for loss to understand love. Do not wait for sickness to value health. Do not wait for regret to choose differently. The biggest mistake people make is believing they have time. I believed that too. And suddenly I was 40, then 60, then 80, and now 103. Time does not move slowly. It moves quietly. And by the time you notice it speeding up, it already has. There is one more thing I must say. Forgive sooner. I lost years of peace because I held on to pride. Arguments that felt enormous at the time now seem laughably small. I don't even remember what most of them were about, but I remember the distance they created, and distance is harder to repair than pride. If you love someone, tell them. If you wrong someone, apologize. If someone wrongs you, consider mercy. You will not regret forgiveness at 103. You will regret stubbornness. As I sit here, I know my time is limited. That does not frighten me anymore. I have made peace with death. After surviving World War II, death stopped being an abstract idea. It became something familiar. But now, at this age, it feels less like an enemy and more like a closing chapter. What frightens me, even now, is the thought of someone watching this and deciding to ignore the lesson. Because you don't get 103 years guaranteed. Most of my friends didn't even get 25. So here it is, the lesson that took me a century to fully understand. Life is not about how long you survive. It's about how gently you live. Be strong when necessary, but be gentle whenever possible. Protect your humanity more fiercely than your reputation. Choose love over ego. Choose peace over pride. Choose presence over distraction. And remember, the bravest thing I ever did wasn't stepping onto a battlefield. It was coming home and deciding not to let the battlefield live inside me forever. If you take anything from a 103-year-old man who has seen the worst and the best of humanity, let it be this: you don't need to fight a war to learn what matters. You just need to pay attention while you're still here. And if you are lucky enough to grow old, may you look back not with regret, but with gratitude.